January 26, 1996. Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. A few miles west of Philadelphia, on an estate the size of a small village, a 57-year-old multimillionaire sits in the cab of a pickup truck clutching a loaded pistol. Outside his window, one of the most decorated wrestlers in American history walks across his own driveway. The millionaire raises the gun. He fires. He fires again. He fires a third time. By the time the police arrive, Dave Schultz, an Olympic gold medalist, a man who had been living and training and coaching and raising a family on the grounds of the DuPont family's most private retreat for almost a decade, is dead in the snow outside his own front door. The man who pulled the trigger does not, at first, drop the gun. He does not, at first, surrender. He negotiates, with the officers surrounding him, for 2 days. Eventually, he walks out of the farmhouse, hands at his sides, and ends up handcuffed in the back of a Pennsylvania State Police cruiser. The headline that ran in newspapers around the world the next morning was a single sentence. The heir to one of America's oldest fortunes has killed an Olympic athlete on his own property. It was, on the surface, a story about a crime. It was, underneath, a story about what happens when a family has more money than purpose, and no one in 3 generations of inheritance ever had the courage to say so out loud. To understand how a single pull of a trigger on a Pennsylvania winter afternoon could do that to the DuPont name, you have to go back almost 200 years to the banks of a river in Delaware. In 1802, on a stretch of the Brandywine just north of Wilmington, a 31-year-old French immigrant built a small stone mill next to a stream. He had been born in Paris in 1771, the son of an economist who had befriended Thomas Jefferson in the closing years of the 18th century, and who had fled France for America after the Revolution. The younger DuPont, named Eleuthère Dupont de Nemours, had been trained in his father's home as a chemist. He had worked in the French government's gunpowder administration. He had seen, with his own eyes, what badly made black powder could do to the men handling it. He chose his spot on the river carefully. The Brandywine flowed fast and clean. There was timber nearby for charcoal. There was isolation, so that an accidental ignition could not level Wilmington. And there was, perhaps most important, demand. The young United States had just fought its own revolution and was about to fight another war, and almost every sack of gunpowder used in either of those fights had been imported from France or England at enormous cost. Eleuthère figured, with the calm of a chemist, that if he could simply make a reliably better powder than the British were shipping across the Atlantic, American buyers would line up at his door. Within 5 years, he was the largest manufacturer of black powder in the United States. The little stone mill on the Brandywine had grown into a cluster of stone mills, a wooden wheel turning on the river, drying houses, a small army of workers in dark cotton caps. The Wilmington newspapers began referring to the family. In shorthand, the entire country picked up, simply as the powder makers. The family name in the United States would forever after mean exactly 2 things: explosives and money. The first generation made the powder. The second generation built the company. Henry DuPont, Eleuthère's younger son, took over the works in 1850 and within 10 years had turned the family's operation into what was, by any available measure, the largest private manufacturer of black powder in the world. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the DuPont company supplied the bulk of the powder used by the Union Army. By the end of the war, Henry was one of the richest men in the country. He was also, by most accounts of him, a man of short temper, deep piety, small smile, and enormous, almost feudal personal authority over his employees. He ran his workers in Wilmington the way an 18th century French aristocrat might have run a chateau, with housing, schooling, churches, libraries, and a company store designed, in theory, to keep them loyal to him until they died. By the time Henry died in 1889, the family controlled not only gunpowder, but the chemistry that grew out of gunpowder. Smokeless powder, dynamite precursors, the beginnings of what would become the modern chemical industry. By the time his sons took over, the company had expanded into roughly 90 manufacturing sites along the East Coast and into the Midwest, and the family fortune had grown so large that no one in it, by the early years of the 20th century, could have spent it in a normal lifetime even if they had tried. They tried anyway. That is where the peak begins. Between 1890 and 1940, the DuPonts built something that almost no other American family has ever equaled. A series of country estates that functioned, all at once, as homes, business headquarters, museums, and stage sets. The family had so many mansions in northern Delaware and the Pennsylvania countryside that residents of the Brandywine Valley still call the main road through it, to this day, simply the DuPont Highway. The most famous of the houses is Winterthur, deep in the rolling hills northwest of Wilmington. It was built and enlarged over the course of half a century by Henry Francis DuPont, the great-grandson of the founder. By the time Henry Francis finished expanding it in the 1940s and 1950s, the house contained roughly 150 rooms and soared 9 stories above the foundations that had been built into the side of a hill. Inside, Henry Francis assembled a collection of nearly 90,000 objects, almost every one of them American decorative arts of the 18th and 19th centuries. The library at one end of the house held, even then, one of the largest private collections of American furniture in the world. The grounds eventually became one of the most important naturalistic gardens in the country. Henry Francis turned Winterthur itself, before he died in 1969, into a museum, and it remains open to the public today. A short drive up the road is Nemours, the estate built by Alfred the Furnt. DuPont, Henry's older brother. Alfred was a different sort of family figure, less interested in the country house aesthetic than in industrial-scale philanthropy. Nemours was completed in 1910 as a French neoclassical mansion of 77 rooms set on about 200 acres of formal French gardens and wooded landscape in Wilmington itself. After Alfred's death in 1935, he left an estate valued at $40 million, an enormous sum at the time, and directed in his will that it be used to fund a children's hospital that still operates today in several states under the Nemours name. Together, Winterthur and Nemours give you a sense of how the family lived, but they are only two of dozens. There were DuPont homes in Aiken, South Carolina, where the family rode horses in winter. There were DuPont homes in Palm Beach and on Fifth Avenue. There were DuPont offices in Wilmington built like temples. There was, by the 1920s, a hotel in Wilmington that the family owned outright and ran for high society weddings, and that was also, for decades, entirely off-limits to anyone whose last name was not DuPont. If you wanted to see a DuPont at a DuPont wedding, you had to be related by blood or not attend. The family had not just money. They had, by then, what the historians of American class call the aristocratic reflex. They believed they were a different kind of person, and they behaved accordingly. There are two ways to think about that peak. The first is that it was simply the natural expression of one of the greatest fortunes in American history. The second is that it was, as one biographer put it, a castle built on top of a powder keg. Inside the mansions lived a family that was simultaneously famous, private, paranoid, philanthropic, competitive, and deeply internally frightened about whether any of them were, on their own merits, worth anything. That fear ran through every generation. The first 3 generations had been men of genuine, if opportunistic, achievement. They had built the works, run the company, made the chemistry, fought in the courts when it was necessary. But the 3rd and 4th generations were, for the most part, men and women whose great heroic act had been to be born on the right day into the right family. They had built their identity around the company and the houses, but they had not built the company itself, and almost every one of them, by middle age, was aware of it. Out of that awareness came 3 things that should have warned the family what was coming. The first was an extraordinarily aggressive attitude toward anyone who married into the family without permission. If you wanted to marry a DuPont, you had to be acceptable not only to the bride or groom, but, in many cases, to the senior male figure of the relevant branch. The second was a long succession of bitter inheritance disputes, several of which ended up in federal court, and at least one of which nearly tore the company itself apart around the middle of the 20th century. The third was the slow, quiet, almost invisible pattern of estrangement between the family and the company. By the time the 3rd generation was in charge, the DuPont company had become so large and so publicly traded that the family was no longer running it in any meaningful sense. They were shareholders in a corporation whose daily operations were handled by professional managers. What does a family that has spent 150 years being the powder makers, but is no longer the powder makers, do with itself? That is the question the family never answered. If you are someone who finds this kind of hidden family history genuinely interesting, then the worst of what comes next is the part you have come for. Into that question walked John Eleuthère DuPont, born November 22, 1938, in Philadelphia. He was, by every measure that the family used to count, a legitimate heir. His father, William DuPont III, was a well-known amateur athlete in his own right, particularly in lacrosse. His mother, Jean, came from a different wealthy Philadelphia family. Through them, John was a DuPont of one of the larger branches, and his potential inheritance was the kind of fortune that takes a calculator to write down properly. He was also, by every account that people who knew him have given since, a deeply odd child from the start. Socially awkward, privately obsessed with collecting, alternately charming and abrasive, uncomfortable with other people's expectations of him, uninterested from a very early age in the businesses that his cousins and brothers were quietly being groomed for. He went to school at the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, which was, by itself, a credential that families of a certain stratum recognized. He went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied science. He wrote a doctoral dissertation on the classification of birds. He published scientific papers on ornithology in journals that the broader ornithological community still cites. He also became, by his late 20s and early 30s, an enthusiastic amateur wrestler, a serious pistol shooter, and a dedicated philatelist who eventually assembled one of the most valuable private stamp collections in the United States. He also became steadily more isolated. Colleagues in the scientific community describe him, in the years between his late 20s and early 40s, as a man who was almost pathologically private. He did not give interviews. He did not attend family gatherings. He did not, by most accounts of his close relatives over many years, speak warmly to his mother for most of his adult life. He bought, in the early 1970s, an enormous property in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles west of Philadelphia, called Foxcatcher Farm, and he set himself up there in a way that appears, in retrospect, to have been quietly built for withdrawal. He built a private laboratory on the property for his bird studies. He built a private shooting range for his pistol competitions. And in the 1980s, as he drifted into middle age and his interest in bird taxonomy began to wane, he turned to a new obsession. It was freestyle wrestling. And this is where the turn begins. For a man of John's standing in the family, the ordinary way to attach yourself to a sport was to write checks from a stadium suite and attend the games. John did not do that. Instead, in the mid-1980s, he began underwriting the entire wrestling program at Villanova University. He paid for the team to travel to international competitions. He paid for coaches. He paid for facilities. Within a few more years, he had built a private training center right at Foxcatcher, had established something called Team Foxcatcher, and had begun personally underwriting the United States national freestyle wrestling team, even though he himself, by every description of his own training background, was not a credentialed coach and had never competed at the highest levels of the sport himself. What he was rich enough to make it real. He was rich enough to buy the equipment, to charter the planes that flew Team Foxcatcher to the 1988 Seoul Olympics and the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, to put up a custom-built facility on his own property that other elite wrestling programs in the country did not have. He also, by the mid-1990s, was running the entire operation as the de facto head coach of the United States team. And within that microenvironment, he was, apparently, king. According to accounts from the wrestlers who lived and trained at Foxcatcher in those years, he was attentive and supportive when the wrestlers were performing well. He hosted their families for Sunday dinners. He paid medical bills. He paid college tuition for the children of staff members. He was, in those moments, perhaps the only version of a family patriarch that he had ever been shown how to be. He was also, by those same accounts, volatile. He would erupt publicly at wrestlers who failed to meet his standards. He would disagree publicly with senior coaches. He would write harsh letters to referees and federation officials. He would, in one well-documented incident, get into a physical confrontation with a referee during a domestic competition in Pennsylvania, an event the sport's governing body eventually fined him for, and which other coaches close to him described, in later testimony, as the moment they realized something was going wrong inside him. What made it difficult to say that he was going wrong, what made it impossible, in fact, for almost anyone close to him to say so directly, was the money. Coaches who might have raised concerns did not raise them because they were dependent on Team Foxcatcher's funding for their own athletes' careers. Wrestlers who might have raised concerns did not raise them because they were dependent on Team Foxcatcher for their housing, their training, their travel, their futures in the sport. Friends and family who might have raised concerns had been told over and over again that John's eccentricities were just the quirks of an unusually private and gifted heir. And John himself, by every published clinical account of his behavior in those years, had begun drifting into using stimulants in private, and into the kind of paranoid ideation that stimulants in private use can produce. If you have ever known someone in your own small life who watched their family cover up a quiet, growing problem, you already know how this part of the story feels. It feels like watching everyone else in the room agree, by silent, unspoken vote, to leave a darkening doorway unaddressed. But what is true in an ordinary family is much worse in a family whose name is also a brand, whose reputation also touches a hospital, a university, a museum, and an entire American mythology about what wealth is supposed to buy you. In early January 1996, the coaches and wrestlers at Foxcatcher saw a noticeable change in John. He was staying inside more. He was more suspicious. He was confiding in a smaller and smaller circle of people around him. He was, by his own admission to neighbors at the time, convinced that his security guards were plotting against him. He was, by accounts the guards gave later to investigators, convinced that his own relatives were attempting to legally challenge his control of the family trust that paid for the whole estate. Dave Schultz saw it too. Dave was, by then, one of the most accomplished freestyle wrestlers in American history. He had already won an Olympic gold medal in 1984, and he had added several world championship titles as well. He was training, at the time of his death, to defend his status at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics that summer. He was also, by every published account of him, the kind of person who could not help himself from making sure the people around him were okay. He took care of younger wrestlers. He helped neighbors on the property. He talked to the guards when they were stressed. In the weeks before the shooting, Dave tried, by all the accounts investigators gathered after the fact, to talk some of those guards into reporting John's behavior to the police. John heard about it. According to the testimony at his eventual trial, John believed that Dave had been turning the guards against him. On the afternoon of January 26, 1996, John drove a pickup truck up to Dave's house on the grounds of Foxcatcher Farm. Dave walked out of his home to greet him. John got out of the truck with a loaded handgun. He shot Dave 3 times. According to the testimony of people who ran out of the house after the first shot, Dave was still alive on the ground when John fired again. The Pennsylvania State Police arrived that evening. John barricaded himself inside the farmhouse at the edge of the property. He refused, for the better part of the next 2 days, to come out. According to accounts from the officers who handled the negotiation, he spoke with them as though the entire episode were being filmed for television. He referred to himself in the third person. He made demands that did not have any practical meaning. Eventually, he walked out of the farmhouse in civilian clothes, hands at his sides, and was taken into custody without incident. The trial that followed, from late 1996 into February 1997, was held in a Delaware County courtroom that had never, until then, played host to anything quite like it. John did not deny that he had killed Dave Schultz. He did not, in any serious way, attempt to deny it. His defense was that he was mentally ill at the time of the shooting and therefore not criminally responsible in the traditional sense of the word. The defense team put on expert testimony from 3 different psychiatrists who had, in their professional opinions, diagnosed John with various forms of psychosis. The prosecutors put on their own experts. The jury sat through 7 days of deliberation. On February 25, 1997, they returned a verdict of guilty of third-degree murder, with the additional finding that John was mentally ill but not legally insane. In Pennsylvania, that is a very specific legal phrase. It means the jury believed he had a mental illness, but that it did not relieve him of responsibility for what he had done. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in state prison. He was sent to Laurel Highlands, a maximum security institution in western Pennsylvania, where he lived for the rest of his life. And here is the strangest part. Inside Laurel Highlands, John did what he had apparently been doing at Foxcatcher, just with a smaller stage. He set up an avian research program in his cell block. According to published accounts from guards who worked with him, he made donations to the prison library. He funded small scholarships for the children of corrections officers. He also, according to testimony from corrections staff, continued to believe, almost until the end, that he had been the subject of a coordinated conspiracy by his own family. He died there on December 9, 2010, of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He was 72 years old. When the autopsy was completed, no member of his immediate family came to claim the body. The funeral that eventually was arranged for him was a small, private affair, and according to family sources at the time, it was attended by only a handful of people who had known him before his arrest. He is, to this day, the only member of the Forbes 400 list of the richest Americans ever to have been convicted of murder. That single brutal fact did more than the private trials, or the quiet divorces, or the inheritance disputes had ever done. It changed the way the rest of the family understood itself, in exactly the way that one event that crosses all the way from private shame to public scandal always does. In the years after the verdict, the DuPont family took a number of visible steps, almost none of them stated publicly as such, to separate itself from the inheritance of the Foxcatcher story. The family, long associated with the Children's Hospital at Nemours, negotiated quietly over several years to have its name removed from a number of institutions that had previously carried it. That process, where it did happen, was reported in the local press of Delaware as an act of institutional rebranding. There were also, by various published reports in the years since, several DuPont descendants who had previously been publicly quiet about their own branch of the family tree who became even quieter afterward. Some of that is just the ordinary human instinct to distance yourself from a relative who has done something unforgivable. But some of it is also the unspoken recognition, inside any family that has ever watched one of its own collapse on a public stage, that the collapse could have happened in any of them. So much of what makes the Foxcatcher story unbearable to think about is that it is not, on close inspection, the story of an evil man. It is the story of a man who was allowed to become isolated, in a family that had been quietly isolating various members of itself for at least 2 generations, with no one willing to speak plainly about what was becoming of him, because speaking plainly might have provoked either a fight inside the family or a public scandal involving the family name. The DuPont family as a whole still exists, of course. Forbes has, in varying estimates over the last several years, included the DuPonts among America's wealthiest families, with an aggregate wealth somewhere north of $16 billion, divided among somewhere in the range of 4,000 living descendants. But the wealth that matters is no longer the wealth of gunpowder. The DuPont company itself, after long and painful succession litigation across the 20th century, was broken into pieces. The original powder and chemicals business merged, was broken up, and was eventually absorbed into a series of large publicly traded corporations whose shareholders no longer carry the family name. What remains of the family wealth, on the Forbes lists and in private branch holdings, is mostly tied to other businesses. the family invested in across the 20th century, and to the equity that remains associated with the original corporation's spin-offs. The houses themselves mostly still stand. Winterthur is now a museum, one of the most important in the country for American decorative arts, and the extensive collections Henry Francis DuPont assembled during his lifetime are still maintained and exhibited to the public. Nemours has become a museum as well, with the Alfred I DuPont Children's Hospital that its founding endowment supports still operating across several states. The DuPont Highway in Delaware still winds past estates that the family once occupied. The DuPont name still appears on a small number of quieter foundations that make grants and fund scholarships in science and conservation. And the family itself, as far as anyone outside it can see, still gathers quietly, occasionally, somewhere, but mostly no longer in public. What the Foxcatcher episode leaves behind is a different kind of inheritance than the wealth itself. The richest families in American history are usually remembered for either what they built or what they failed to build. The DuPonts will hold both at once. They built one of the great industrial fortunes in the history of the Western world. They built Winterthur and Nemours, and they gave those houses to the country. They built the science of black powder and the chemistry that came after it. They also built, in 3 generations, a version of private family life that left a man wealthy enough to underwrite an entire Olympic wrestling team and utterly isolated enough to shoot a friend in front of his own family. You do not need to know anything about gunpowder or bird taxonomy or Pennsylvania real estate law to recognize what is going on in that sentence. Every family in the world has the same basic temptation. Concentrate enough wealth, and it becomes possible to insulate the people inside the family from everyone outside it. Concentrate enough insulation, and it becomes harder, generation by generation, to tell the difference between a private grievance and a public disaster. By the 4th generation, in families of any size, the people inside have not been meaningfully held accountable by anyone outside in decades, and the people inside have, almost without exception, lost the habit of holding one another accountable too. What is new about the DuPont story is not the wealth itself. It is that the family happened to be carrying the news cameras, the auditors, the obsessed reporters, and a wider world increasingly interested in what concentrated wealth does to the people who inherit it. And what concentrated wealth did in this case was, in the end, exactly what had been visible, to anyone paying attention, for 40 years before the shooting. John DuPont was probably going to be institutionalized, whether anyone had done anything about it or not. Dave Schultz was probably going to die from something, eventually. The family name was probably going to shrink into a footnote in chemistry textbooks. But the moment when it all came together on Foxcatcher Farm, on a cold afternoon in January 1996, was the moment when a family had to admit to itself, and to the country, that 3 generations of insulation had finally cost them one of their own. What you do with that admission is, in the end, more important than the admission itself. The DuPonts, by most accounts of them in the decades since, have chosen the quiet option. They have rebuilt their philanthropy on a smaller scale. They have gradually withdrawn the family name from institutions that had previously advertised it. They have let the houses become museums, which is the closest thing an old fortune has to a graceful exit from public life. None of these choices erased the day in January when an Olympic wrestler bled out in his own driveway. None of them changed the fact that the family had the resources, the experts, the architects, and the lawyers to make any number of different decisions before that afternoon, and made every one of the wrong ones instead. The lesson of the DuPonts is not, in the end, a lesson about money. It is a lesson about the slow, almost gravitational way that too much of it changes the people carrying it. The powder that made the family rich also made the family frightened. The fortune that made the family safe also made the family paranoid. The houses that gave the family dignity also gave the family the illusion that the rest of the world did not need to see what was happening inside those houses. And by the time the rest of the world got to see, on Foxcatcher Farm in Pennsylvania in 1996, what was happening inside the houses was already too late.